Welcome to the Westport Library. Today's program will begin momentarily. Supported by Verso Studios, created locally and shared with the world.
Good evening, friends. Beautiful night, right? I'm Bill Harmer, the Executive Director of the Westport Library, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to this special celebration, the launch of Something Better, the debut novel by our dear friend, Diane Parrish. Diane and her husband, Steve, have not only been cherished members of this community, but they have been steadfast supporters of the library and its mission, and good friends to me as well. So it's quite an honor to be here tonight to mark this exciting milestone in Diane's literary journey. Tonight we gather to celebrate both family and storytelling. Diane will be joined in conversation by her daughter, Amanda Parrish Morgan. Many of you know her, but for those of you that come to our programs at the library, you may recognize her too as a familiar face at the library because she was a guest at our annual literary festival, Storyfest. And she too is an accomplished writer. Her book, Stroller, was named one of the New Yorker's best books of 2022. She just got through telling me she just finished her 5th book. And her work has also, her essays, her book reviews, and other pieces have been written in numerous prestigious magazines and publications like The Atlantic, Wired, Lit Hub, and The Washington Post, among others, just to name a few. She lives here in Connecticut with her husband and 2 children, teaches at Fairfield University, the University of Chicago's Graham School, and at the Westport Writers Workshop, right here in Westport. I had the distinct pleasure of getting an advance copy of Something Better this summer. It was one of the books that I enjoyed reading this summer. I was deeply moved by its rich, multicultural, multi-generational character development. Diane has a remarkable gift for creating characters that feel alive, each with their own powerful emotions, flaws, and deeply human stories that resonate on many levels. One of the aspects that struck me most about the novel is how beautifully it illustrates the importance and recognition of our shared humanity. In a world that often feels divided and quick to judge, Something Better is a refreshing reminder about the power of grace, of understanding, and forgiveness. And Diane's exploration of these powerful themes throughout the novel is not only thought-provoking, but deeply human. And the storytelling lingers long after you finish reading it. So for those of you who haven't had that pleasure yet, I hope you had the same experience that I did. Tonight we had the privilege of witnessing a heartfelt conversation between mother and daughter, surrounded by family, friends, and a wonderful community, both deeply united by their shared love for storytelling and the power of words. So it's my pleasure to welcome both Diane and Amanda to the stage.
No kidding. This is unbelievable. I am. Oh, should we use them perhaps? Anyway, I'm not going to say a whole lot because I might start crying and it's too early to ruin my mascara, but thank you so much for being here.
yeah, I'll just echo that. It's really amazing to be up here with my mom and supporting her launching her first book into the world, and also just been really wonderful to see so many familiar faces. I saw a childhood friend from growing up, a high school teammate's dad, my daughter's speech therapist, like seeing these people from all different walks of my life has, just kind of like a testament to what a special town Westport is, I think. And it's cool to be doing this event in this library that you brought me to often, as a kid. It's just a really special place. So thanks everyone for being here.
Yeah, that's fine.
So I think first my mom is going to read a little bit from the beginning of the book, and then I have some questions for discussion, a few other sections that you might want to read, and we'll do some audience Q&A also toward the end of the event.
Thank you, Amanda. This is really fun. It's hard to read sections from a novel without giving away too much, so you have to be careful what you choose. So I'm going to start with the preface to the novel. I may give some samples of later in the book about who these characters are, but this is the very beginning. It's before February 2009. The house sits inside a snow globe. The man and the woman catch glimpses through the swirling flakes of the party glittering within, a scene of warmth and light and laughter, confirmation they'd been right to risk the storm. They pick their way along the ice-covered walk toward the front door. She clutches his arm until he can guide her safely into the welcoming embrace of their hosts. The door closes behind them, and the storm ceases to exist. This is a real party, not some faculty chips and beer affair. There are bartenders and servers, passed canapes, drinks in crystal glasses. Somewhere a piano plays. The guests are well-dressed, preparing to make a night of it because it's beastly out there, and in here is all they need. He gravitates toward a lively group of fellow professors by the fire. She wanders until she reaches the library where a handful of guests are quietly chatting from the comfort of large leather chairs. They found their people. Whenever he replenishes his drink or revisits the buffet, he peeks in the room where she sits, lifting his glass or raising his eyebrow. She smiles, nods yes or no. He sees to her, then moves on to charm another group. They roar at his stories, beg him for more. By night's end, he will have collected a dozen new acquaintances, and she will have made a new friend. A perfect evening. When it starts to get late, she finds him, catches his eye, and touches the watch on her wrist. She stands by the door, waits for him to shake hands with every lingering guest. By midnight, they're the last ones in the foyer. It's all, thank you, goodbye. Maybe you should stay. It's so awful out there. Oh no, we'll be okay. Stepping into a furious wind, she asks if she should drive, but he assures her he's fine. He fires up the heater, scrapes the windows, then takes the driver's seat, full of news to share about his version of the night. Of course, I'll be careful, but listen to this. At first, he seems up to the task. Not too fast, she reminds him. For the most part, he keeps his eyes on the road, and they skid just a little now and then. But on this winter night, the wind is fierce, the road is winding, and the driver is distracted. He's still talking and gesturing when they begin to slide sideways downhill. Only when the car starts to spin does silence descend, and the laws of physics have their way. The car whirls in wider and wilder accelerating spirals until it leaves the road, careens through the woods, and smashes headfirst into a tree. Snow falls all night, obscuring their tracks and the trail of broken limbs. It isn't until the next afternoon that a beam of sunlight glinting off a window catches the eye of the snowplow driver passing by. The location of the car makes retrieval difficult. The passage of many hours renders rescue impossible. The plow driver keeps vigil until the police arrive, then resumes his route and makes his way home to his wife. He walks in the door and describes what he's seen. Who? How? She asks, what if you hadn't happened by? He asks, but what if I'd been there sooner?
I actually wanted to start with a question that I didn't write down, so I'm going a little off script, even for my off script self. But one of the things I think is really interesting about the setting of the novel, as you keep reading, you find out a bit more about the small Connecticut town where the family lives. But I was thinking about setting in the sense of time. I wondered if you wanted to mention or share anything about why you decided to set the novel in 2009 in particular.
Okay, well, there are several reasons, actually. I set it in 2009 because that's when I very first started thinking about this book. Yeah, I know, that was a long time ago, right? Because of some things that were happening in my personal life at the time, some things I was observing, the topic of forgiveness was topmost in my mind quite often. I actually witnessed two contrasting circumstances. One was a couple I observed where there had been infidelity that was rather well known in the community, not this community, but another community. And somehow these people worked through that and stayed together and seemed to come out of it genuinely stronger in a place of grace and forgiveness. And I observed another situation in my own family where there was an estrangement with someone who was terminally ill. And despite that fact, the people who were estranged could not get it together. And so when the family member died, they were still estranged. And I just kept thinking about these contrasting circumstances. Why is this possible and this was not possible? And I kept thinking about forgiveness. How does it happen? Who is allowed to offer it? Who's allowed to receive it? How easy it is or not to receive forgiveness. So that was the context. I also wanted to set it in a time before cell phones and texting were ubiquitous, because that changes every story. If you can constantly get a hold of somebody and talk about trivial nonsense all the time, it just changes the dynamic when people are together in person. So I just decided, I'm gonna plop them in 2009, they're gonna stay there.
Well, I was even thinking in the opening, some context that listeners may not have totally gotten, just is that the family who's at the couple that's at the party have just moved to this town. And I was thinking about how that's an important piece of information for why it takes until the morning for, I mean, not that necessarily someone would have alerted someone if they didn't come home, but it just adds to the fact that it was easy for this accident to go undetected. And then also, though, I think your point about cell phones, and we learn later that this couple has a daughter, and again, not that necessarily the daughter would have been texting all night long, but it's just one more layer of sort of the possibility for time to go unaccounted for. Mm-hmm. But I was also thinking too, later, with not giving anything away, but later in the novel, there's a time when a character travels abroad. And I remember in 2009 when you traveled abroad, it was like, don't turn on your phone or it's gonna cost $9 million. So like that, but now we're lucky to go to London this summer, and it was like, well, there's Wi-Fi everywhere. I'm just using my phone like I normally, so there, I think even ways maybe that happened, the way things changed since 2009 work in service to the novel's plot as well. I know you mentioned the context that you were considering thematically, but I think it's interesting. Mm-hmm. I had read something that a lot of novelists are increasingly using dystopian settings or historical fiction settings because it's really hard to imagine very many circumstances in present life where someone is legitimately out of touch. You know, maybe one time someone's phone dies, but you can't have that be a recurring plot point over, and if it's just, you know, like realistic literary fiction. But it's interesting, you know, to think maybe we don't have to go back to 1832 or something in 2009, or so recently, especially, you know, an academic couple that's in their 50s might not be glued to their phones, and people would really be out of, it would be reasonable to not hear from someone.
That was part of the consideration too.
So now I'll go back on script, but I wrote down, you have told me, and you mentioned just now, that the idea for the book came from a desire to write about forgiveness and its complexity. In the novel, characters struggle to forgive both themselves and others. What popular notions about forgiveness did you want to push back against or to more deeply explore?
That's a good question. I wanted to look at it from every possible facet because forgiveness is absolutely essential. We cannot get through a single day without forgiving the person who cuts us off in traffic, the person who's rude to us on the phone, whatever. All day long, we have reasons to feel slighted. And if we don't learn, starting with those little things, to just forgive and let that roll off of us, we become angry, hostile, unhappy people. And then from there, depending on the wrongs that have been done to us, the demands get harder. I was thinking about, there's a quote at the very beginning of the book from Jessamine West, which I will read very quickly to you, that also is an aspect of this forgiveness. She says, "It is very easy to forgive others their mistakes. It takes more grit and gumption to forgive them for having witnessed your own." And that's a part of forgiveness too, because accepting somebody's offer of forgiveness means admitting you messed up, and that's hard to do. It's also, another aspect of forgiveness is sometimes you can only forgive if you only know so much. If you know every single aspect about what the harm that has been done to you is, it's just a bridge too far. So I explored that in the book a little bit. But the main thing I wanted to focus on is forgiveness can take a long time. You can't give up on it. If it doesn't happen, it's not like in those movies where, I forgive you, and you run and hug the person and it's all fine. Sometimes it's like that. But sometimes you forgive somebody on Tuesday and you wake up on Friday and you're like, I gotta do it again. I'm still upset about that. It's a process and you have to hang in there and be with it. So I wanted to explore that aspect, that it is complicated, takes a long time, and absolutely essential.
So my next question is also about this idea of forgiveness. I wondered, words like forgiveness, grace, absolution, exoneration, and understanding are often used together or even sometimes interchangeably. But as a writer, I know you have specific reasons for describing the book as about forgiveness rather than, you know, exoneration or absolution, for instance. Can you talk more specifically about that word in particular and the spiritual or religious connotations it has for you and for the characters in the novel?
Okay, well, that is a part of the book. I wanted to look at this whole forgiveness thing from 3 different points of view. So I have 3 different characters coming at it from a different place. One of my characters is a believer, and so her need to forgive and her understanding of forgiveness comes from her faith tradition and how she's trying to live out her faith. Another character is not. He's a moral person. He tries to do the right thing by other people, but he's basically a self-contained, self-supported system. And then the third character isn't really a person of faith, but she does have spiritual aspects. She's the daughter of the people who died, and she's still connected to them spiritually. So I thought it would be interesting to look at the forgiveness problem, benefit, from those 3 different points of view throughout the book. It was an intentional choice on my part.
I was thinking that, you know, when you talked about how if you can't get over somebody cutting you off in traffic or whatnot, how there is a character in the book who doesn't do that. he's sort of like, you said something like, if you can't forgive these small daily slights that we all experience, then you risk becoming a bitter and sad, grouchy person. And I think we see that happen to it.
I think we see that happening. Yes.
I would say it's not just three perspectives, but four.
Many.
But a notable absence of forgiveness on one character's part.
Which causes a huge problem.
Yeah. So the word forgiveness, I love etymology. I'm such a nerd about this, and I think it's often so interesting to think about words that we use. Like recently the word empathy has been everywhere. Recently, in the past 15 years, it's not that recent, but in thinking about like what's the difference in empathy and compassion, and sort of these abstract concepts that become sort of culturally huge for a period of time, and then how the language around those concepts changes or doesn't, I think is really interesting, especially in the context of writing. So I looked up the history of the word forgiveness, and it comes from German. It means to give up, which makes me think of something that you've talked to before about forgiveness being something we have to actively decide to do, and you kind of alluded to that now about maybe you forgive someone on Tuesday and then you have to do it again on Friday. So I can't remember if this is in the novel or just something, this sentence I mean is in the novel or just something you had talked to me about, but that an important part of forgiveness, it's not just forgiveness is important and yet it takes work, but essential to forgiveness is the fact that it takes work. And I wondered if you would want to elaborate on that at all.
Yeah, I think there's an expression, cheap grace. It's a little bit like that. Cheap grace or cheap forgiveness is not always genuine or lasting. And I think for it to have a long-term impact, it requires some, everything that matters requires some effort. So forgiveness that's lasting requires some real effort, and you have to make some sacrifices to achieve that goal. It's definitely worth it, because the alternative is dreadful, but it's not always easy, yeah.
So in line with my word research, I learned that the word forgiveness has taken off exponentially in usage since about 2000. I also think these kinds of things are really interesting, like why we use the words we do, and when something becomes sort of a buzzword. But forgiveness shows no sign of plateauing. So
I say, hey.
But I'm wondering if you have any. Not to put you on the spot because I don't have a theory about it, but do you think that there's anything significant about this word becoming, much more common in these measures are just of written language, since there's no way to, record how often in conversation, but why our writing is increasingly interested in forgiveness in the past, quarter century or so?
I haven't thought about it. I didn't know that was actually the case. I could hypothesize on the spot that if we spend much time online, we see a lot of need for forgiveness. Maybe a positive way of looking at it is we're recognizing that it's important and talking about it more, and that would be terrific.
I don't know why. I wasn't trying to say, I hope you, I hope you know why it is, because I just did think it was interesting. Another sort of abstract concept that's at the core of the novel is grief. And I think from the section you read, people get a sense of sort of immediate grief in the aftermath of the death of the two people that we've met briefly in the preface. But I think that there are also other, maybe even more private or subtle types of grief in the novel about maybe lives that we never get to live, or hopes or dreams that are going to have to go unrealized. So I wondered if you wanted to talk a little bit about the subtle ways that this type of grief affects the different characters, and or maybe the ways that sometimes grief can be difficult to recognize if it's not like a big capital G grief.
Yeah, there are a lot of things to grieve in the book. David's self-image is something to grieve. David and Ruth are unable to have children. That's something that they grieve. Obviously, Annabeth loses her parents. That's something to grieve. She had to leave the town where she'd been before. That's something to grieve. Ruth's ideas for her own career, David's ideas for his business. There are lots of losses along the way. And one of the things I observed in myself in times of grief, and I've seen in people around me, is grief is so incredibly disorienting, and the more you ignore it, the more disorienting and damaging it becomes. So if you pretend you're not really knocked sideways by whatever it is you're losing, you're just going to continue to be buffeted by the winds that are knocking you sideways. So I thought that was an interesting aspect of grief, how, I mean, the people in the book make questionable decisions. I will just put it out there that not everybody will approve of. Well, I don't approve of them. I don't know why they did those things. But they make decisions that are questionable because they are rocked. Their worlds have been really shaken up, and they're not on a straight trajectory of thinking clearly, putting one foot in front of the other. But I see them doing things I do not approve of, and I felt a great deal of compassion for them because I understood why they were doing those things. And I want the readers to feel that way too, that even if you don't agree with everything they've done, you understand why those things have happened and why those decisions were made. I hope this is true. There are no bad guys in this book. And I wanted it to be that way, that there was nobody to finger point. Well, there's one guy who's kind of a bad.
But he's also sort of a minor character.
Very minor.
You know, like in Shakespeare, when there's like the person who has to come on the stage to like make the next thing happen. He's kind of more
he's like that.
Like, so yeah, but
the main people who are suffering are empathetic characters, I think.
So you sort of anticipated my next question. I wrote, I have a vivid memory of being in my 20s and saying what I considered to be sort of a throwaway phrase, a good person. I think I was saying something that I myself was, quote, trying to be a good person or something like that. You reacted very strongly to say that there are no good people or bad people, just good decisions and bad decisions. I mostly, although maybe not entirely, I do think of some examples that are hard to see as it's purely a bad decision in the real world, agree with this framing. I see this playing out in the novel, the difference between good and bad traits or good and bad decisions, you know, those we see in the novel, as opposed to good and bad people. And you've talked a bit about that. I don't know if you wanted to say anything else.
I think I've said what I need to say about that.
So on that note, one of my favorite examples of a nuanced character like this is a character called Aunt Janet. And I was wondering if have it convenient, if you would read that tomato scene for us.
Tomato scene. Oh, yes, I can read the tomato scene. I didn't bookmark it, though.
Oh, sorry. I'll
keep talking, and I will find it.
And if you want to say anything else about Aunt Janet, feel free to. But just to say who Aunt Janet is, Annabeth is the daughter of the couple that died in the car accident. And Aunt Janet is her sort of like, tells it like it is, a little bit grouchy, tough love aunt, excuse me, sorry, who comes to visit from Kansas because she sort of feels like Annabeth is not taking good care of herself and not setting affairs in order after her parents' death, but she's not going to be like snuggly about it. She's going to be a little bit tough lovey about it. So this is a scene when she's visiting in Connecticut.
Yes.
And I
have
found it. Okay.
I have it. So Aunt Janet arrives. She's a force of nature. So I'm sorry, give me 1 second.
That's fine.
At that moment, a car appeared at the end of the driveway. Theo put his hand on her elbow. Come on, let's face the dragon together. They walked around the side of the house to greet Aunt Janet, who was hauling a suitcase from the trunk of her rental car. Here, Theo said, let me help you with that. Janet ignored him and hoisted the bag out of the trunk and plopped it on the driveway. Then she removed a large zipper tote and a well-taped cardboard box and set them on the ground next to her bag. Tomatoes, she said without turning around. Jack told me there wasn't a decent tomato to be had in the entire state of Connecticut, and I'll be damned if I'm eating mush when I have a garden full of better boys that would melt in your mouth. Hi, Aunt Janet, Annabeth said. How was your trip? The usual hell that happens when you get the inmates running the asylum. Boarding the plane from the front, no food, seats designed by a CIA interrogation squad. I told the flight attendant, just keep the darn Coke if she was too cheap to leave the can. Oh, my. Well, Aunt Janet, this is my friend Theo Comstock. Janet turned and stuck out her hand. Glad to meet you. You from around here? Yes, I live one town over. Are you sure I can't help you with your things? Here, take that suitcase and I'll get the tomatoes. Don't want you dropping them after I held them on my lap the whole way here. Except for takeoff and landing, of course, when the flight attendant made me stuff them under the seat. As if that makes any difference at all. Rules for no reason, that's just what that's all about. Janet put the tote over her shoulder, picked up the box, and started toward the house. Now Theo looked at Annabeth with his eyes wide open. She shook her head, then giggled. They trailed behind Janet until she arrived at the back door and shouted, "Any chance somebody could open this door?" Annabeth ran to grab the handle, but David was already pushing it open from the other side. Janet stepped into the kitchen saying, "Thank you. It's nice to know there are still gentlemen in the world." Annabeth quickly glanced back at Theo, who returned the look in bemused puzzlement as he stepped through the kitchen door, pulling Janet's suitcase. Janet placed the box of tomatoes next to the kitchen sink, sighed grandly, and surveyed the room. "Are we having a party?" "Just friends for dinner." She made introductions. And then the last thing I'll say is, "Can I get you a glass of wine?" "No, thank you. I'll have a scotch on ice." So although it's about forgiveness and grief, and there's some bad decisions being made, there are also some parts that are kind of maybe funny in the book.
And I feel like most of us know an Aunt Janet or whatever
yes.
the uncle version is
Oh,
of
yes.
Aunt Janet. I don't know. So without giving anything away, I'll just say that the book ends in a manner that's open to interpretation. And I imagine different readers might imagine a different next scene, if the book were to continue, for David, Ruth, and Annabeth. I wondered, this is just really a writer question, not a plot question. So I wondered if in your mind, you have a next scene. Like, do you know what happens to them a year, like what their lives look like a year later? Not to share that with the readers, but just wondering if you made a decision to frame the story with these particular months and imagine a movie, cut the scene at the moment you did, because that's the end of this season, that's the end of this arc, or because the potential of forgiveness at the novel's end is truly still so ambiguous, even for the characters, that I guess I'm really just wondering how you conceived of it from a writing perspective. Did you think of it as, I want to end the story here because I want readers to see that forgiveness is not a guarantee, and maybe that's putting words in your mouth, or because when these bad decisions have happened that affect other people, their implications are long-lasting? Or was it more, I'm ending the story here because these characters have told me only this much?
I do have another scene in mind, and I think I do know where I see them a year from now. But this story was about the time that it takes to achieve forgiveness, and I wanted to stop it at this moment when they've decided to do that, but they haven't done it yet. And I know where I think they will be a year from now. One of the things I really wanted to try to do in the book was have the readers be engaged in the story. I'm not a big fan of a book that flashes everything in neon lights and spoon feeds me as I go along. I like the book that expects me to be involved. And I wanted actually someone said this to me and I was like, my work here is done. I want people to leave the book wondering, where are they now? What are they doing now? I wanted the characters to feel real, and I wanted their story to feel like it was continuing even off the page after the last page.
So I wondered if there are any other novels that you've read, or I guess it doesn't have to be a novel, but that end in a sort of similar vein, where there not only is what happens next ambiguous, but the actual language itself leaves even the moments that are depicted up to various interpretations, that that you really liked or admired, or that provided inspiration, sort of other writers who've done this?
All these books I liked and admired, and they also drove me kind of crazy. So Long Island, that was the sequel to Brooklyn. I don't know if anybody read that out this summer. And we're wondering, right? I thought it was really well done. I liked that. Another book from a couple of years ago called The Paper Palace. Now, the author says she made it very clear what happened, but I beg to differ. I think it was open to interpretation. And I don't know if anybody read The Bee Sting. Anybody read that book?
I loved that book, but
Yeah.
we had very different
interpretations
of the
about what happened in the last scene. So yes, I think I may unconsciously gravitate toward those kinds of books. I like those kinds of books.
Me too. And then just my last question, and feel free to touch on anything I haven't, but this is more a writer question again. I was wondering if there were certain scenes or moments that came to you first. So I know every writer's process is a little bit different. When I'm writing fiction, I usually tend to have a character that comes to me first, as opposed to a plot. Definitely not a fully developed plot. And if a plot element came to me, it would probably be like a scene or a concept rather than, but I think a lot of writers are not that way. So I wondered if there were particular scenes or moments that came to you first, and if it was at all complicated to engineer the other moments and characters around those. So I was thinking about that, especially when you read the opening, how some things I hadn't really thought about until tonight, that it's important that the couple doesn't really know that. I understood right away why it's important that Annabeth isn't rooted in the town, because the daughter of the couple that dies, is in college. So she's coming home, and her parents have just moved. So she's coming home to a community she doesn't know, which sort of sets up this situation where she's not only grieving, but really alone, literally alone. But anyway, when you read the opening, I was thinking, oh yes, it really makes sense that they're also new to town, and that they only know this one other family well besides the coworkers and whatnot. So I wondered if there were times when you thought, oh, to make this concept or this scene or this character do what I want them or him or her to do, I have to figure out a way to have them lose their cell phone, or whatever were there any tricky situations like that?
Oh, definitely. I mean, the germ for the book was the characters as opposed to the plot. The theme of forgiveness and the characters were the first things that came to me. But definitely you have to manipulate the plot. I had to have, when she's in China, I had not only was the international challenge of cell phones, her boss had to tell them all, shut down your cell phones, we don't want them spying on us. So I had to make it really, really, really hard for her to be in touch with anybody. And I wanted Annabeth to be alone and extremely vulnerable. She's an orphan. She doesn't know anybody, and she's really at sea, so that she was really pushed to her limits. And I wanted the marriage to be pushed. I like pushing to limits, I guess. I wanted the marriage to be pushed to its limits, so I separated them for long distances and made it hard for them to stay in communication. So yeah, I fiddled around with the plot to up the tension.
So for instance, you're sitting at your computer drafting, and are you thinking, okay, now what am I going to do to make it so that they haven't seen each other? Or I'm just curious, how wholly formed do some of these? You may not.
It happened. Well, it happened as I was writing it. I mean, our situation was not the situation, but your dad traveled all the time, so it was really hard sometimes to stay in touch. We had to work very hard at it to make sure we talked every day, and we didn't. Those days we weren't texting. We had to really make that a priority. And I was thinking how, if you didn't, it's very easy not to. And if you didn't, that's when you start to drift apart, and that's when you can get into trouble. So I just was imagining, what if they didn't work that hard at it? What if they took it for granted, that this great relationship that they had, and they could just put it on autopilot and it'd be fine? And then things started popping in my mind about how that could be worse.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I don't know if there are any other sections you wanted to read, or if you want to open up to questions.
I do want to open up to questions, but I want to also say, we've talked a lot about heavy stuff, about marriages coming apart and grief and stress and forgiveness, but there is some humor in the book. And I would say the overall notion, the overall tone at the end of the day after the book is completed is hope. There is hope. It's a hopeful book. And a couple people not that many people have read it, but the people who have read it said that they found it to be a hopeful book too. So don't despair.
Sorry for not emphasizing that I don't find hopeful to be like a primary selling point of a book. Like, I just mean like, well, let's be real, like not everything's hopeful, so that doesn't bother me, but yes, that's true. I don't think the ending is bleak, but I didn't mean to focus on the negative. I just was like, well, yeah, of course.
I know, you like your dark. Yeah, sure, I'll take any questions, sure.
If anyone has any questions for Diane, please come to this microphone so that everyone can hear you and we can record your question.
I think that one. I think the microphone is back there in front of that screen.
Over by Jennifer.
I can make up questions if you want.
That's my grandson. How long did it take me to write the book? You want my honest answer, or you want me to do my fudgy answer?
She wants your honest answer.
Okay,
She's
well,
your friend.
Yeah, okay, Roxy. I first thought of the book in 2008-9, and I'd write on it for a little bit, and then I'd think, who do you think you are? You can't write a book. And I'd put it away and stop thinking about it, and then I'd pull it out again and think, well, maybe you can write a book. It took me years. It took me a decade to write the book. And then I just had it living on my computer until the early part of the pandemic, when someone in my family said, you need to finish that. And I did.
Hi, Diane.
Hi, Mark.
Hi. Did you come across, or did you develop at all in putting this together, especially on forgiveness, the possibility that the nature of forgiveness for a particular person may have to do mostly with what they demand of it or expect from it? I can imagine because talking about plopping that way back in time, plopping it even further back in time in a different cultural way, where perhaps people might not have as easily turned to their feelings to see if they forgave or not, or they may not have lived in that kind of way, and therefore the nature of forgiveness and even its availability to them might have been different that way. Did you?
I didn't think about it so much in terms of time, of culture over time, but I definitely thought about it in terms of differences among people, between people. So yeah, I mean, I think it's a very personal thing, how people forgive and how long it takes and what it looks like. I heard a line the other day, something like, sometimes the only apology you're ever going to get does not include the words, I'm sorry. And that's true.
Yeah.
So.
Very good, thank you.
We have a special question coming, so hold on 1 second.
Okay.
Hi, so I just had a question. When did you exactly finish writing the book?
When did I finish writing the book? You know, that's a very good question, Simon, because you can think you're finished writing a book, and then you send it to an editor, and they think otherwise. Or you send it to your agent, and they think otherwise. So I think I didn't finish writing the book until last week, right? Right, Merrill Moss people?
Good question, Simon.
It is a good question.
You talked a lot about forgiveness, obviously, and I was wondering if you thought there was any relationship, in different parties, between and amongst different parties, the relationship between forgiveness and understanding, and how you think that those might work together, if at all.
My quick answer is I think forgiveness might be easier if understanding were a part of it. If we could find a way to understand why the person's done whatever he or she has done to us. It might make it a little easier to forgive. But I think the need to forgive can't be dependent upon understanding, because the person who suffers when you don't forgive is the person not forgiving. The other person might not even know, may just be going about their business happy as a lark. But you're tearing yourself up inside. So understanding is a plus, but it's not essential in my opinion. What do I know? But that's my opinion.
Hi. This thing is so high. I'm just wondering, as a first-time author, how did you decide what your process would be? How did you decide how to draw your characters as individual profiles and sketches of each one, put them together, or just sit down and say, here's my story, beginning to end?
Well, I saw these people, as soon as I conceived of the characters, they were very clear to me. I saw them physically, I knew their personalities, I knew their traits. I didn't have to, sketch them out or even write a description on a piece of paper for who they were. They were my family. They were in my living room. They were in my kitchen. I knew them. So they came to me first. And my process was, for a long time, just catch as catch can, because I was doing a lot of other things. But mostly, I composed in my head on walks. And this is before everybody had a voice. Now I sometimes write in a voice memo on my phone if I'll think of something. But in those days, I would go for long walks, sometimes come up with whole pages, and I'd be thinking, remember, 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 and I'd run in the house and get a legal pad and a pen and just start writing down what I had come up with on my walk. That is probably why it took me forever to write the darn thing.
I wanted to piggyback off of what Simon was asking about, which was a hard act to follow, since he talked about completion, and that's what I wanted to speak about. So thank you, Simon. And I wanted to dive into that more and kind of ask you about the moment you felt that this book was complete and how much of that had to do with the story being completed and the characters being able to express everything you wanted them to express, as opposed to it being like, hey, I'm ready to release this. I feel like I've completed this mission that I was on, and now I want to give it to the world. And so at what point and which one was a major factor in that?
Well, actually, it's both of those things. I would say I felt that the book was complete, which I found out was not the case, but I felt that the book was complete when I'd said what I wanted to say, the characters had acted out their stories in the book, and I felt like their stories were told. But I think the key was when I reached the point where I thought, oh, I'm gonna let somebody else read this. So then I knew it was, I knew it wasn't perfect. They're never perfect, but I thought that's a complete book when I'm ready for somebody else to read it. Amen. That's a great question, actually. Hi, Thea.
Hi. Wait, no. Oh, yeah. So, were there any scenes in the book that you didn't like writing? And also, do you have any tips for writers?
I'll just quickly say Thea is my daughter, and she's a really good writer. She loves writing, and she writes beautiful stories that amaze me. So she's asking for tips because she's a working writer herself.
She is a working writer. Thea, that question about any scene, that's a great question. Yes, there were a few scenes in the book I didn't really want to write. There's one pretty shocking plot point in the middle of the book, and I rewrote it many times because I didn't like writing it, but it just kept wanting to come out the way it came out, so I finally wrote it the best way I could write it that didn't bother me. Tips, let's see. You are a really good writer already, so my tip for you, I mean this most sincerely, is keep doing it. Keep writing like you're writing. Just keep putting your stories in a way that you can preserve them, and don't stop.
Is it okay if I just say one other thing? I don't mean to extend our time. I just was going to mention really quickly that one of the things I didn't get to talk about, but hopefully everyone heard, is just how beautiful at the sentence level the book is. I know that phrase sentence level is kind of a writer, nerd, inside baseball thing to say, but to me that's what really makes a book wonderful, right? Like there's the idea that there's 7 basic plots, it's a sort of a meme that goes around, or like that Shakespeare wrote every story there is to write. And I think is something to that. There's sort of these archetypal stories about adventures and forgiveness and betrayal and, you know, the templates. But what I think hopefully everybody who was able to hear the passages that my mom read heard just the beauty of the language. You were talking about how long it took you to finish, and I think in part that, you know, certainly the doubt all writers have and the revising and all that does take a long, long time, but I think also the perfecting of the sentences, I'm sure, was part of what took a long time as well. So,
Thank you for saying
yeah.
that. Well, before we leave, can I just say something too? Okay, I'm going to do this without getting... This is amazing. It's amazing to look out here. We've lived in Westport 34 years, and I see people from all aspects of our 34 years here in town. You know, sometimes people, oh, Westport's so entitled, or those people are so rude, or whatever bad thing they want to say about Westport. Baloney. Westport is full of wonderful people, like the ones sitting in this room tonight. And I am so moved that you guys are here, and thank you so, so much for coming out tonight.
Thank you so much, Diane and Amanda, for sharing something better with all of us. For you all in the audience, thank you all for coming out and making this night unforgettable. We do still have a few copies of Something Better if you haven't already purchased. Diane will be signing your books right here to my right. If you could just give us a moment to get her situated, then we'll be able to have a little bit more of the party. Thank you so much for coming out.